it's a temporary memory. Temporarily memory, actually it is temporary memory, okay, in which entity objects are stored. Objects are stored temporarily, okay, for the temporary period. Okay, so we can say entity manager will have its own independent persistence context. So the entity manager which we have created, each entity manager will have its own independent persistence context. That means that if I created the first entity manager, it will have its a separate memory. That is what the first level cache, in which actually whatever the object we are trying to store into the database, or whatever the object we are trying to retrieve from the database, all that object will be get stored in that temporary memory. And that temporary memory is nothing but the persistence context, we can say. That is nothing but the persistence context. Okay, this persistence context contains the live connection with the database. What I'm saying, see, this is what I'm saying, like persistence context will contain, it will contain live connection to the database, live connection to the database. What exactly mean of this one? That means what, if you guys update persistence context, it can update, it will update database, and that is what we call it as the live connection. Through that one we can do, by updating the persistence context, we can update database, and that is because of it have the live connection with the database. But as the entity manager is get closed, your persistence context will be get removed, it will be get deleted, it will be get closed. Okay, so because what I said here, like every entity manager will have its own independent persistence context, So as we have closed that entity manager by using the close method itself, we can do that one. Okay, so automatically it can just close this persistence context. And as the persistence context is been deleted, as the persistence context has been closed, automatically whatever the instances, that means what, whatever the object you guys have been created for entity classes, that will be get automatically deleted. Okay, so in this case actually the entity manager will keep track of the changes done in the entity. What I'm saying, see here, actually entity manager, through this one entity manager will track the changes, done in entity object, we can say entity objects, we can say. Here I can simply say entity manager will track the changes, done into the, we can say, entities, whatever the object we have created. Okay, so that object which we have put it into the persistence context. Okay, so here the same changes, whatever the changes we guys have been done, okay, into the object, that will be done to the persistence context, and that will be get automatically reflected into the database. As you done the commit operation. So for example, see what I said here, like a entity manager, we have created the entity manager, okay, and through that one we apply the persistent. See actually we have started the get a transaction, okay, that entity manager dot get a transaction, entity manager dot get a transaction, and that one we have write a begin. So we have just started that one. So transaction is been get started. Now in that one, if you guys have written entity manager dot persist, entity manager dot persist, and here you guys have the employee object, or assume like it is the student object, any. So as we have written like this one, your this object will be get attached to the persistence context. That means that it will be goes there into the persistence context. And after that one, if you guys have written that commit entity manager dot get transaction here, I will just copy this. Okay, control C here, and I'm just putting this control V. And here if I return here the commit, if I return the commit. Okay, so as you guys have written the commit, whatever the changes, okay, this object have, that will be get reflected to the database. Okay, so this is exactly we can say about entity manager. Actually, no doubt these entity managers are of two types. These are the two types of entity manager. One, extended scope persistence context, we can say. Sorry, persistence context are of two types. There are two types of this one. Control C here I just made. Control V, persistence context types, we can see. Types. So there are the two types. One is the extended scope. Extended scope persistence context. Extended scope persistence, we can say context. Okay, so actually this is the default for the non-container managed. This is for a, we can say default for non-container managed. Non-container managed persistence context, we can say. Okay, so that means what it is, see actually in the spring core, you guys are going to understand that what is exactly the container managed and what is exactly the non-container managed. Non-container managed means what? Manually you as a developer, you are creating the object of entity manager class. Okay, so default for non-container managed entity manager, I can say entity manager class. So if entity manager, if you guys have created programmatically, then it is called as an extended scope persistence context. We call it as the extended scope persistence context. And there is another one, we call it as a transactional scope persistence context. Actually, when it is what actually we can say it is default for container managed entity manager. See, actually container manager and non-container manager, we are going to discuss it into the in the spring core itself. Okay, so we will see that exactly. But here in a simple word, you guys have to understand here that when object of entity manager, you as a programmer have been created, then it is called as a non-container managed. And if someone is there, that is what the container, that container is responsible to create an object of entity manager. Okay, then it is called as a container managed. Okay, so in our case, we are created the object of that. So we are in the extended scope of persistence context. Actually. Okay, so persistence context is nothing but the first level cache, or it is the temporary memory where the entity class object will be get stored temporarily placed. Okay, so from there only it will go to the database. Okay, so here you guys have the persistence context. I just again last will try here. Persistence context. Okay, this is my persistence context, and from there record will be go to the database. From here actually record will be go to the database. So first, as you create object, it will go to the persistence context. As you create object, it will go to the persistence context, and from there it will be go to the database. Okay, if you retrieve that one, then again it will be come to the persistence context, and from there you can perform the operation. So it will be still there in the persistence context till you have not closed your entity manager. You have not closed your entity manager. So this is exactly what I can say about persistence context. Hope it is clear. Yes. Yes. Any question here?
No.
Okay. So from here actually we have the Java application, or we have the Java code. From that one, it will always go to the persistence context, and from there it will be go to the databases. Okay. So now I will just try to explain. Okay, through this persistence context only, I'm going to explain you the entity life cycle actually. Entity, entity life cycle. Entity life cycle. You guys know that what is entity class. So that entity class, whatever the object we have created, whatever the object we guys have been created, okay, so that entity class have the life cycle. Okay, so that if we understand the life cycle of the entity class, okay, then we will understand exactly how we are performing that merge operation, or the find operation, or the remove operation, or the we can say update operation, like that. So actually, whenever we go to the entity life cycle, we have some states, or we have some phases actually. Phases. Okay, multiple phases are there for the entity life cycle. First phase of a entity life cycle is, we can say, new phase. What I'm saying, new phase. New phase of a entity, we can say. This is what the entity life cycle for the entity object I'm saying, simply. Okay, so there is the first one, new phase of the entity, we can say. New phase of the entity. So here actually, when we create a object of a entity class, object of a entity class, when we create an object of entity class, automatically your entity comes into the new phase, we can say new phase, or it is also called as a states, we can say. Okay, so if we have not created the object of entity class, that entity is not existed. Now as we create object, of entity class, entity comes into the new phase, we can say. So we have the assume, like we have created the student entity, student entity. Okay, that I just created a small student entity. Okay, is equals to new. Okay, then we can just say this student entity class. Okay, I just putting here control V. Okay, and then I just created object of this one. You can write record like 101. Okay, I'm just putting here the jam. Okay, and then I can just make it as the, okay, comma 60. Okay, this is what the, we can say, the record of that student. So as I create object of this one, it comes into the new phase of a entity life cycle, we can say. Then there is another one phase. We can say managed phase. Managed phase of a, we can say, entity life cycle. Managed phase of the entity life cycle. So when actually, when we guys have written the entity manager dot persist, what I'm saying, when we have written entity manager dot persist. Okay, entity manager dot persist, and in that one we have written the student entity manager dot persist, and a student entity. So as we have written like this one, then we can say that your entity object comes into the managed phase. We call it as the entity object comes into the managed phase. So in this phase actually, in this phase, entity object, entity object get attached, get attached get attached with the persistence context. Persistence, we can say context. Whenever, as we written like this one, as we written like this one, so your object will be get attached into the persistence context. That means that it will be get putted into the temporary memory. It will be get putted into the first level cache. That is what we have we observed, that it is the persistence context. We have just put it into the persistence context like that. So it is very important actually. We have in the persist, and it goes into the managed state. Or sometimes what we did, like we have written entity manager dot find, entity manager dot find over here, entity manager dot find over here, and we are just putting what we are putting just here. We are writing a student entity dot class, okay, comma, here we are putting that 100 or 101, we can say simply 101. That means that what we are trying to retrieve that object through the find, and here we have the employee, or we have the student object, student, I can say entity. So whenever I'm just putting like this one to student entity, not the persist, okay, but here do, if I try to write em dot find, what it will do, it will retrieve that object from the database. It will retrieve that object from the database and put into the persistence context. So I just say retrieve object from database, object from database, and put into persistence, persistence, we can say context. And that again I can simply say, if your object is into the persistence context, if object is into the persistence context, then it is called as it is in the managed state. So I just say in short, if object is in a persistence context, then it's called as it is in we can say managed state, managed, we can say phase, managed phase. Okay, so this is what, so this is what exactly the managed phase. It is in between actually the database and your code, we can say. Okay, so from there itself, there is another one phase, okay, we can say, okay, that is what the third phase actually. Okay, it is what exactly the third phase, okay, we can say. So it is simply, we can say, removed phase, removed phase. That means what, simply see, removed phase is what actually whenever we have removed the record from the persistence context. Okay, it is like we have removed it from the persistence context. Removed record, or the object, removed object from a persistence context, persistence context, we can say, removed record from the persistence context, then we call it as the removed phase actually. We call it as the removed phase. And then finally we have the fourth phase. We can call it as the, detached phase. Detached phase actually. So it is what a detached phase. That means what, if we close, we can say, if you close entity manager, if you close entity manager, okay, all entity objects, all entity objects will go into, I just say, detached. Okay, so detached, it is what the final phase, of a entity, we can